Learning number 2 on the causes of homelessness. This is the second of 2 learning forums that our community has been taken on this month as a part of our intentional learning around homelessness. We did this last year, and the speaker that you're about to hear was so very popular and so compelling and instigated so much conversation that we really decided it would be great to welcome him back. So I want to introduce our speaker tonight. We are honored to welcome back University of Washington professor Greg Colburn to speak with us tonight about the causes of homelessness. Dr. Colburn is an assistant professor of real estate at the University of Washington's College of Built Environments, and he has a PhD in public affairs from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota. His research interests include housing policy, housing markets, housing affordability, and homelessness. And he is the author of a really remarkable book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, not to cut to the chase of where we're going tonight. So I want to introduce and thank Dr. Colburn for being here tonight. It's a real honor to have him back here in this forum. A couple of logistic pieces before we get going. I am going to mute everybody, so your microphones will be on mute. During the presentation, Greg, would you prefer that we hold questions till the end, or would you be open to taking questions in chat throughout?
Yeah, please go ahead and ask throughout. And if I'm not focusing on the chat, Marcy, just interrupt me and say there's a question. I'm happy to respond to those while they're top of mind. Sometimes it's more effective to deal with it while we're on that topic instead of waiting. So please interrupt.
Okay, so if there's questions, please put them in the chat. And I think we will have time for questions at the end as well. Okay, thank you so much for everybody for your patience in getting us started. And the floor is all yours, Greg.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me back. And for those of you who are coming back for a second dose, I admire your perseverance. I apologize for the redundancy here. I am happy to share with you this evening. I apologize, my title slide is, I didn't update it yet, but I'm speaking to our Seattle Architectural Foundation on Wednesday night, so I'm going to use the same slide deck, but I just didn't have a chance. I went from meeting to meeting to meeting to you tonight, so I apologize for that. But this is the presentation, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, which is the name of our book, and I'm just going to try to get to full screen here. Why am I don't usually do this in PDF. Well, that'll do it. Okay, so this is the book. My co-author Clayton Alderman and I worked on this beginning in 2019. The book came out and was published by University of California Press in March of this year, of last year, 2022. I forget that we're now into 2023. And the reason that I wanted to write this book was since moving to the Seattle region in 2017, I've been involved in all sorts of conversations around homelessness. And I left these meetings thinking, I don't think we really understand what's driving this, this crisis, unfortunately. And because we didn't have a firm grasp of the causes of homelessness, we are struggling to end it. And we end up focusing on all sorts of different issues, and they're competing explanations that end up complicating our fundamental response to the crisis. And as a result, it persists, and in this case, it's getting worse. And so that was really the motivation for writing the book. And so when we talk to, as Marcy said, as we move to talking about causes of homelessness, we need to think about causation. And as someone who got a PhD in public policy, a lot of the coursework that I took was related to causation. And we want to understand how do we determine if policy X actually works, right? And so when we think about causation in the physical sciences, sometimes that's a lot easier, right? If we drop a pencil, we would say that that's gravity, right? And there wouldn't be a whole lot of dispute around that. In the social world, because human beings are complex, causation becomes infinitely complex. So if I ask the question, what causes someone to be admitted to Harvard, as someone who has college kids and went through the admissions process last year, the answer to that question is, boy, that's complicated, right? There are all sorts of reasons why someone might get into Harvard. That person might be really smart. That person might be a really good recruited athlete. That person's grandparents may have given $100 million to Harvard, right? So all these things come together to produce an outcome. It's very hard to say, well, here's the specific cause of why someone would or would not get into Harvard. And when we move to homelessness and we just ask a general question, which is what causes homelessness, the point is a whole bunch of different things, right? And so I have never experienced homelessness. I've never experienced housing insecurity. And so obviously that position is important when I talk about this. I'm not speaking of it from any personal experience whatsoever. I have spoken to a lot of people who are currently experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness in the past. And I can tell you each story is unique. The pathways, the stories, the different things that came together to produce homelessness are unique, every single story. So I'm not here to suggest that there's one single pathway into homelessness. And if I did do that, I think that would be irresponsible. But the point is that causation becomes complicated. And it's complicated by the fact that we every January, actually this coming week is the annual point in time count. And so when we do the census where we count the number of people or we create an estimate of the homeless population. And in connection with doing that count, we actually ask people questions about their experiences with homelessness. We'll ask them, why are you homeless? And we get all sorts of answers from people. And this is from the 2019 point in time count, right? I got divorced. Right? I got in an argument with my roommate and he or she kicked me out. Right? My husband abuses me and I left with my kids. I drank too much, right? There's any number of answers that people might give as to why they are experiencing homelessness. And when I see this list, I always cringe a little bit because when the Seattle Times gets a hold of this, they'll say these are the causes of homelessness. And I fundamentally disagree that divorce is a cause of homelessness. I don't believe it is. Now, I do believe firmly that divorce in the wrong set of circumstances can lead to homelessness. No doubt about that. I firmly believe that domestic violence can be a cause of homelessness, but I don't believe it's the root cause, right? If my wife were a victim of domestic violence tonight, she wouldn't experience homelessness tomorrow. In a different set of circumstances, someone else who's the victim of domestic violence might. Okay. And so what we have is, and we're asking people, why are you homeless? And we get these answers. And so who am I to say that that's not the cause of homelessness, right? And so what we try to do in the book is to draw a distinction between two things. One is, what is a precipitating event that might lead someone to experiencing homelessness? Domestic violence, poverty, addiction, etc. No doubt about that, all those things increase the likelihood that someone's going to experience homelessness. The difference between that and a root cause is the fundamental underlying factor that produces homelessness at high rates. And that's what we try to do in this book, is to highlight the difference between those two things. So here's a little story to hopefully help explain the difference between a precipitating event and a root cause. Imagine the game of musical chairs, 10 players, 10 chairs. The leader starts the music. Everyone walks around in a circle. They take one chair out. And when the music stops, everyone scrambles to find a chair. In this case, Mike was on crutches because he had a bad ankle and he wasn't able to move quickly when the music stopped, and therefore he lost the game. And so if we were to ask Mike, like we do in the homeless survey, why are you chairless? What would he say? I had a bad ankle. Right? And within the rules of the game, that's probably true. That's probably true. The ankle injury is probably a good reason why Mike likely lost the game. But if we take a step back and think more critically, the reason that Mike didn't have a chair when the music stopped was because there weren't enough chairs. And if there had been 10 chairs, Mike would have found a chair. It might have taken him longer as he hobbled over on his crutches, but he would have found a chair. And so this is what's happening in cities like Seattle where housing is scarce. There are people with any number of vulnerabilities in Seattle, and when there's a really tight housing market where there's severe competition for housing units, people who are vulnerable, people who has risk factors for homelessness are the ones who are going to lose that game. Right? But then when we see those people on the street, what do we say? We say, well, of course he or she's homeless. They're addicted. They're mentally ill. They're poor. Instead of focusing on the fundamental reason why they are on the street in the first place, which is they were unable to secure housing. That's the point of that we try to highlight in the book. There's no doubt that drug use, mental illness, poverty increase the risk of homelessness at the individual level. I would never suggest that that's not the case. But we also know from research and just through basic descriptive statistics that those conditions produce homelessness in some locations, but not in others. So why are people who are poor in Seattle experiencing homelessness where in other communities poor people aren't? That's an important question, and that's really at the root of the book that we wrote. So the organizing question for the book is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? For example, Seattle has 5 times the per capita rate of homelessness of Chicago, 2 cities that I've happened to have lived in my life. And we believe, Clayton and I, my co-author and I believe that if we can answer that question, that will tell us something about the core nature, the root nature of the crisis of homelessness, which will hopefully then inform our ways to get out of this. If we can understand why Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. have a lot more homelessness than everywhere else in the country, that should tell us something about how to potentially end it. Now, a common explanation is, well, if we know that drug use, mental illness, and poverty increase the risk of homelessness, a perfectly plausible explanation for the fact that Seattle has way more homelessness is because we have more people with those conditions. That is a perfectly reasonable explanation for this. It turns out, though, it's incorrect when we look at the data. So this book is about cities. It's not about people. It's not to undermine the importance of person-focused or individually focused research. That is absolutely critical. But this book has a different purpose, which is to try to figure out what the heck is going on in Seattle and San Francisco and LA, et cetera. And the thesis of the book is that tight housing markets, places where housing is really expensive and where it's not very available, meaning there aren't many vacancies, those tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities and produce homelessness at much higher rates. And in places where housing isn't available, these individual vulnerabilities, the bad ankle in the musical chairs analogy, serve as a sorting mechanism in terms of identifying the people who are most likely to be homeless in a place where there isn't sufficient housing. So it shouldn't surprise us when we walk down on 3rd Avenue in Seattle and we see someone who's addicted or mentally ill on the street. The game has been set up in Seattle such that people are going to lose. We have too many people and not enough housing. And the fact that that person with that condition ends up losing that game shouldn't surprise us. It's a tragic outcome, but it shouldn't be a surprising one. Just going to check the chat here, make sure I haven't missed anything.
You're good. Nothing yet.
Okay. Okay, so just to orient people on rates of homelessness, there's huge variation around the country. And what's important when you think about rates of homelessness is you have to compare like jurisdictions to like jurisdictions. So some places count their homelessness at the city level, meaning just within the borders of that particular city, New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, for example. Other places like King County count at the county level. You can't compare cities to counties because counties, all else equal, have lower rates of homelessness because you're including suburban locations. And so what we need to do is to figure out variations to say, what's the variation among cities where they count at the city level? And what we see is the variation is pretty significant. In New York, DC, and Boston, it's about 10 per capita. And in Indianapolis, it's about 2. So there's about a 5-to-1 relationship between New York and Indianapolis. That's huge variation, statistically speaking. We want to understand why that is. When we move to counties, the numbers are lower because of this suburban phenomenon that I talked about. But the relationship actually holds. There's about a 5-to-1 relationship between the high and low per capita jurisdictions. LA County, Santa Clara County, King County, and Multnomah County are all about 5, and Hillsborough County, which is Tampa, is about 1. So what's interesting is regardless of the unit of analysis, meaning what the geographic boundaries are of where you're counting, the relationship basically holds at 5-to-1. And so that's the variation that we're trying to explain. What is it about these places like New York City, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Boston, LA County, Santa Clara County, King County, Multnomah County? What is it about these places that are producing these really, really high rates of homelessness? And if we can understand that, we hopefully learn something more about homelessness. So we use 3 chapters to go through conventional explanations of homelessness to determine, do these help us understand that variation that we're interested in the book? So the first category are a series of individual explanations. And the most obvious explanation is poverty. Obviously, poverty causes homelessness. There's no debate about that whatsoever at the individual level. If you're poor, you're far more likely to experience homelessness. But what's interesting is when you plot poverty, and so here you're going to see a lot of charts like this in the next 10 minutes, just to orient you. The bottom axis or the x-axis here is poverty rate. So in this case, this would be 10% of the people in your city are below the poverty line. And we do this for both cities on the left and counties on the right, because we do separate analyses here. And then on the y-axis or the vertical axis is the rate of homelessness. So what's interesting, in R squared is a statistical measure of how what the relationship is between these variables. And so there actually is some relationship here, R squared of 0.14. This number goes between 0 and 1. The bigger that number gets, the stronger that relationship is. So there's a modest relationship here. But what's interesting is the relationship is opposite of what you expect, meaning where poverty is really high, rates of homelessness tend to be pretty low. And where poverty is quite low, homelessness tends to be much higher, which is a head scratcher, because if poverty causes homelessness at the individual level, then why wouldn't we see lots of homelessness in places that have lots of poverty, like Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Baltimore? We don't. In fact, what we see is a lot of homelessness in places that are very affluent, like San Francisco and Seattle, two of the most affluent cities in the country. So homelessness doesn't thrive amidst poverty. It actually thrives amidst affluence, which is really, really counterintuitive, but it's perfectly consistent with what we're seeing. Homelessness, the homelessness crisis is most acute in the wealthiest cities in our country. So it's not that we have more poor people in Seattle. In fact, we have far fewer poor people in Seattle. But the consequences of poverty in Seattle are very different than they are elsewhere. Another common explanation at the individual level is mental illness. This data, it comes from the states, because the federal data on addiction and mental illness is better at the state level than the city or county level. But it's the same logic. So this is every state in the nation, their rates of serious mental illness between 2007 and 2019. And what you see here is there is some variation. There's places with more mental illness than others, but there's zero relationship, R squared of 0.05, zero relationship between rates of mental illness and homelessness. So the problem in California, Oregon, and Washington is not that we have way more people experiencing mental illness. Basically, it's fairly evenly distributed throughout the country. The consequences of mental illness are definitely different here, but it's not that we have more of, quote, those people. We don't have more addicts. We don't have more people who have behavioral health issues. That's not the case. The same thing is true when you look at substance use disorder. Again, R squared is basically 0. There's no relationship. Okay. So again, it's not that we have more drug users here. It's the consequences of drug use are very different in Seattle than in Chicago, right? Chicago has people who are mentally ill. Chicago has people who use drugs, but they don't have anywhere near the homelessness that we do. So then we turn to some local contextual factors, like what is it about Seattle that produces these outcomes, right? And I hear these every day when I go on the road and talk about my book, and in meetings, these explanations frequently come up, so we want to address them in the book. The first one is the weather. I frequently hear that the West Coast has a problem with homelessness because we have moderate weather. And compared to Chicago, that's very true. January in Chicago is not pleasant, but I always push people and say January in Seattle, frankly, isn't that pleasant either. 39 degrees and rain is not something that I really would want to live outside in. Now, so then people will say, well, what about San Diego and LA? And I'll say, sure, that makes perfect sense. But when you actually look at this, you think about Miami and Dallas and Phoenix and other places that are warm in January, don't have anywhere near the homelessness of the West Coast. And when you plot temperature and homelessness, what you see is there's zero relationship. There are warm places with low rates of homelessness, and then there are cold places like New York and Boston that have much higher rates of homelessness. So the point is that we can't blame the weather for homelessness. There's something else going on to produce homelessness at disproportionate rates, because we got cold cities, we got warm cities that have high rates of homelessness, and the opposite is also true. We also frequently hear that there's a draw to certain cities because of benefits, meaning that the benefits are very generous in some location. Therefore, people will move to that location to take advantage of those generous benefits. And because of the way our welfare system is structured in the United States, we have huge variation in the generosity of welfare benefits from state to state. And this is because of welfare reform in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, which created the modern welfare system called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And one of the hallmarks of that legislation was giving states significant power over determining the level of benefit. So even though it's a federal benefit, the states can determine how generous it is. And so what we have is massive variation. Some states are really stingy. Some states are very, very generous. So we can actually see, do we see homeless folks congregating in states with really generous benefits? And if so, that would lend credence to this argument that there's this magnet effect with welfare. When you actually plot the generosity of welfare benefits divided by the cost of living, housing costs, what you'll see is there's huge variation in terms of generosity, but it bears no relationship whatsoever to homelessness, right? So we don't see more homelessness in places that are generous. Okay, so again, that one's tough to, when you look at the data overall, that argument kind of falls apart. Another way to test that argument is to look at mobility. Is there a migration to places with high rates of homelessness? So what we do here is we look at all the people moving into these jurisdictions, either cities or counties, and look at what percentage of those people are below the federal poverty line. And what you'll see is that there are poor people moving to every city and county in the country at different rates. But what you actually see is that there are more poor people moving to places with relatively low rates of homelessness than otherwise, right? The relationship is actually a little bit negative. But the point is, the fundamental point of this graph is that we don't see disproportionate low-income migration into places with high rates of homelessness, right? We don't have tons of poor people moving to Seattle to experience homelessness to take advantage of the system that we have here. In fact, we have a relatively small number of people who are moving here below the federal poverty line. The final explanation that I frequently hear, and there was certainly a large-scale battle over this between former President Trump and Governor Newsom of California, when President Trump blamed Democratic policies in California for the homelessness crisis. And Newsom said, well, no, that's not the case. The real problem here is that the federal government backed away from supporting low-income households over the last 40 years. Neither of those arguments really are correct when it comes to homelessness. Newsom is correct that the federal government has stepped away, but that doesn't really help us understand regional variation, because if that really were the cause, then why would Chicago have 1/5 the homelessness of Seattle? They would presumably be equally deprived of federal benefits. So that argument doesn't really hold. Trump's argument doesn't really hold either, because there are plenty of left-leaning Democratic cities that don't have big problems with homelessness. And in fact, when you look at it, and we looked at all the cities in our sample, which is 35 of the biggest cities in the country, I didn't realize, I knew this was true. I didn't realize how true it was. Democrats run cities in the United States. And that might be good news to you or bad news to you, and that's a topic for another evening. But generally speaking, Democrats run cities. Miami and San Diego briefly had Republican mayors, and then New York City had an independent mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, when he was mayor, but he was basically a Democrat, right? And so if we want to blame Democrats, that's fine, but then you would need to explain, why don't Chicago and Cleveland have big problems with homelessness? Because they are huge Democratic cities, right? So the point here is that these local contextual factors, while convenient and a common scapegoat for homelessness, don't really hold up to scrutiny when you look at it a little more broadly. So the final category of explanations that we pursue are housing market explanations. And so we've basically struck out in the first two categories of explanations. None of them have provided a very good explanation for this regional variation. When we turn to housing market characteristics, all of a sudden, ta-da, we actually start to get some real explanatory power here. Where rents are high, this is median contract rents, where rents are high, homelessness is high. Okay, this isn't groundbreaking research. This has been known for some time, but it really does stand out when you compare this explanation to the other explanations that I've talked about over the last 10 minutes or so. Okay, the same thing is true with vacancy rates. Where vacancy rates are low, meaning where housing is not very available, homelessness tends to be much higher. Okay, and these R-squareds, while not 1, are still much, much higher than what you get for any of the other explanations that we've pursued. So the point being that if you were just to say, blindfold me and say, Greg, I'm just going to give you a rent and a vacancy rate for a city, I could tell you with a fairly high degree of confidence if you're going to have a problem with homelessness or not, without knowing anything else about those particular jurisdictions. So the question then is you may buy this, you may not buy this, that's totally fine. But if you do buy this, then the question would be, Why do some cities have high rents and low vacancies? That seems to be pretty darn important. And if so, let's try to figure out why that might be the case. So in Seattle, a common narrative would be, well, we had a tech boom that started with Microsoft and has continued with Amazon, and we've had hundreds of thousands and millions of people who moved here and make a lot of money. This is a demand story. The demand for housing has gone up as people moved here and made more money, and it drove housing prices up and lowered vacancies. Absolutely. That seems like a perfectly plausible explanation. But what's interesting is when you plot population growth and homelessness, you get no relationship, right? These R-squareds are really low. Modestly positive in cities, but in counties, basically zero. And this was a real head scratcher for me. And I realized that after running this a few times, the reason why this wasn't telling me much is I was only focusing on the demand side of the story, meaning population change and income, which drive the demand for housing. And I was ignoring the supply side, meaning how much housing do we have? And so when I dug into these numbers and I looked at each of these data points, each of these cities are represented in these data points, I found cities around the country that were growing just as fast as Seattle, but didn't have the same problem with homelessness. Which then caused me to move to this typology to hopefully make some sense out of all these numbers that I've thrown at you. So it's 8 o'clock. I'm not going to go through the elasticity math here. That's not a nice thing to do with Greek letters here. But the notion of elasticity is important. The idea being when the price of a good changes, suppliers have a decision to make. They can make more of it, they can make less of it, et cetera. And so when the price of housing goes up, the question is how much housing gets built, because suppliers of housing, once the prices go up, certainly will be motivated to build more housing. But the problem is housing takes a long time to produce. And so generally speaking, the elasticity of housing is a lot less. The supply elasticity of housing is a lot less than other goods or services. But across cities, that elasticity changes a lot. And it's driven by two factors. One is topography, where you have mountains and water like Seattle does. It's much harder to grow your housing supply because the land, the buildable land is just less. It's harder to build on hills, et cetera. The second factor is the regulatory environment. How easy is it to construct housing? How easy is it to get a permit? How easy is it to go through all the regulatory procedures that you need to do to get a housing unit built? And so what economists have demonstrated is that places with challenging topography and tight regulatory environments have very low supply elasticity, meaning as prices go up, you don't build nearly as much housing as other places. Okay. So this chart is an attempt to show both the demand for housing and the supply of housing on the same graphic. So to orient you here, on the x-axis or the bottom axis, you have change in population. And this is really a proxy for the demand for housing, meaning as population increases a lot, the demand for housing goes up. So these cities on the right, Charlotte, San Antonio, Boston, San Francisco, Seattle, all have high demand for housing because they're growing quickly. On the y-axis, we look at housing supply elasticity. 1 is considered the neutral point for supply elasticity. Numbers above 1 would be places where you build a lot of housing when prices go up. They would be called elastic markets. Numbers below 1 would be places that we would call inelastic, meaning even as prices go up, we don't build very much housing. Okay. And so the two quadrants that I want to highlight for you is the first one is this upper right quadrant, which is really the Sun Belt. What you had there is really rapid population growth, just as fast as Boston, Seattle, and San Francisco. But they have very elastic housing markets. They've built a whole bunch of housing. And as a result, they've been able to maintain a reasonable housing market. The numbers in parentheses are their rental market vacancy rates. Numbers above 5% for rental market vacancy rates would suggest that you have sufficient housing, and in some cases, an oversupply of housing. So even though Charlotte, Austin have grown super fast, they've built a bunch of housing and been able to keep up. The issue with the lower right quadrant is you have rapid population growth combined with really inelastic housing markets where you don't build enough housing, and therefore you end up with a housing crisis. And you can see the vacancy rates for all three of these cities are really, really low. 3% vacancy rates are razor thin. And so while tragic, this combination of demand for housing and insufficient supply is an obvious outcome to what has transpired over the last 15, 20 years in these cities. Okay, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone because we knew we were jamming a whole bunch of people into communities that were not building enough housing. And so what's going to happen? prices are going to go up, vacancies are going to go down. And if you're vulnerable in some way, shape, or form, you're going to be the victim of these moves, of these changes. And that's what we're seeing. That's why you have a homelessness and housing crisis in Boston, San Francisco, and Seattle. And you don't right now in Dallas or San Antonio. So if you buy this, the question is, what do we do? And because this is a regional issue, regions really need to think about this. And fortunately, our state, especially this year, and we're hearing this from Governor Inslee on down, a really, really significant focus on housing at the state legislature, which is great. And King County is focused on this, the city of Seattle is focused on that, and I've been involved in a lot of these conversations, and so I'm encouraged. From a homelessness standpoint, historically speaking, most of our investments in homelessness have been what I would call operating investments. And that's to fund the crisis response system in terms of shelters and other systems, providing services to people who need them, et cetera, et cetera. What we haven't really done is prioritize capital investments, which are needed to construct housing. And that's something that we have lacked. And as a result, we do not have an adequate supply of affordable housing for people who need it. And as a result, what we're saying as a community, as a region, if you can't afford market rate rents, you're kind of out of luck. And if you end up homeless, then we'll have this system where we have some operating investments, put you in shelter and provide you some basic services, and that's what we're going to do. And unfortunately, that system is a very difficult system for people to experience and also to get out of. And so what's happening is this crisis just keeps building on each other, and more people are falling in, and it's impossible to get out, and more people come in, and more people come in, and this crisis that we see every day walking around Seattle keeps getting worse. And so we need to think about the types of investments and the scale of those investments to ensure that they're sufficient to the scale of the problem. And from a regulatory standpoint, in Seattle and San Francisco, we need to ensure that where housing is difficult to construct, which it is. One, because of topographical constraints, we can't change that, but we can change the regulatory environment. And that gets to how we use our land. Do we really want 70% of our parcels to be zoned single family in Seattle? I would argue the answer to that question is no. If we really want to be serious about addressing this housing crisis, we can't force everyone who moves to Seattle and wants to live in Seattle into 30% of the parcels. That simply doesn't work. And that doesn't mean we need to outlaw single family homes, but we do need to think about single family zoning. I live in a single family home. I like a single family home. But I also recognize that we live in a major metropolitan area, and everyone can't continue to live in a single family home if we're going to accommodate all the people who want to live here. And so that's going to be a fundamental change in our community. And we're not alone. Every big city in the nation is wrestling with us right now. How do we change our land use to continue to accommodate growing populations? So what makes this response really difficult, and why I wouldn't really want to be mayor of Seattle right now, is that you have these tensions that are really, really difficult. One is you have a major unsheltered chronic homelessness crisis right now. That's a fire that's raging in downtown Seattle, and we need to fix this tomorrow. And the problem is the most compelling solutions to that crisis are long-term in nature in terms of building sufficient housing. And so what do we do? How do we allocate dollars to the short-term crisis response versus the long-term fundamental solution? That's a difficult tension to resolve. The answer is you have to do both, but that's tough if you're an elected leader and you have a 4-year term to quote figure this out. The other tension is whose responsibility is this? Should this be the private market's responsibility, build more housing, or is this the responsibility of the public sector? And do people trust the public sector to provide the solutions? And then even if you think, yes, this is a public sector issue, is this an issue for the city of Seattle? Is it an issue for King County? Is it an issue for the state of Washington? Or is it an issue for the federal government in Washington, D.C.? And what you'll end up with, and this has happened over history, is people pointing fingers at each other. Governor Newsom saying, we've got a massive crisis here because the federal government doesn't provide support for low-income households. And Newsom is absolutely correct. 1 in 5 people who are eligible for federal housing support actually get it. The other 4 are left without any support. Food support, if you are eligible for food stamps, it's now called SNAP, every person eligible for food support gets it. For housing, we take a very different approach. And we in essence have a lottery. 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people actually get it. And so the federal government is pushing 4 out of 5 people who need housing support to their local states, counties, and cities in these local jurisdictions to say, you got to figure it out. And housing is terribly expensive. And so now you have governors and county commissioners and mayors saying, wow, this is a really, really expensive problem. And Washington, D.C. is basically saying, we've washed our hands of it, right? You got to figure this out, Washington, which is why this is a really, really hard issue. And unfortunately, the scale of the problem is such, and we've let this go long enough that now these solutions that we're talking about need to be tens of billions of dollars of scale. Right. In the Seattle housing levy, I was just on the task force to help determine this, and it's going to be around an $800 million number, which is wonderful. I'm glad that we're going to raise that money, and hopefully the voters will support that. But it's nowhere near sufficient to solve this crisis. And so what I kept saying in the meetings at City Hall with the technical advisory committee was, what is going to be the messaging around this housing levy? Because we're going to ask people to support this to the tune of $800 million, and we also recognize that it's nowhere near sufficient. That's a tough political message. But what I didn't want to happen was us to say, we're going to raise $800 million, people do it, and then in a couple of years, everyone's angry because the problem didn't go away. Well, it won't go away because this is a 10 or 15 or $20 billion problem, not an $800 million problem. This is tough. This is why being an elected leader right now is super, super difficult. So in summary, and then we can turn it over to some questions and comments, is the reason I wanted to write this book is because I firmly believe that diagnosing homelessness as an individual issue, as an individual failing, will undermine our efforts to end this crisis. Unless we think about this structurally, we will not garner the resources and political will to make the changes that we need to do, because it's just easy to blame individuals. It's easy to say, well, look at Joe. Joe has made poor decisions in his life, and therefore he's gotten a lot that he deserves. Okay. When we think about what is the context in which Joe is experiencing these problems, and we start to think about the housing system as a whole, saying we structured a system that guarantees that someone's going to end up on the street. And it turns out, unfortunately, that's Joe. Then it forces us to think very differently about Joe's experience. If we have a structural understanding of the crisis, and we understand that, then we need structural responses. And structural responses are housing, ending racism, ending huge wage disparity in the United States, right? These structural issues that continue to plague our society. And so one of the challenges with this is then people throw their hands up and say, well, Greg, this is almost impossible. How are we ever going to get there? And people will say, well, how do you know that housing will end homelessness? And my answer to that question is we know that housing works because the federal government in about a decade ago said, we don't want veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan to experience homelessness. The Vietnam generation was largely ignored when they came back, and many of these men had terrible lives, post-traumatic stress, et cetera, lots of addiction, lots of mental illness. And veterans were grossly overrepresented in the homeless population, as are Black and brown people. Okay. And so the federal government said, people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the Vietnam generation. Therefore, we want to make sure they don't experience homelessness. And leaders of both political parties stood up and voted yes to that, and they devoted resources to it. And what happened? We cut veteran homelessness in half over 10 years, which is a remarkable achievement. And how we do it? We gave them housing. Right? For some people, it was a voucher, and then you would just go into the market and use that voucher to access housing. For some people with more acute needs, it was a housing unit with supportive services to deal with their addiction, behavioral health issues, whatever the case may be. But the point is, we know housing works. We've demonstrated that with this subpopulation. The question is, will we expand that logic to a broader population of people who need it? And that's a question of values, of political ideology, of resource allocation. And these are kind of the open questions that exist for our society right now that we continue to wrestle with. So anyway, that's I think that's all I have for you this evening. And I look forward to responding to questions and hearing what comments you have in response to my talk here.
Thank you so much, Greg. I'm going to keep the spotlight on you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to call out a couple of things. First of all, Don makes an observation about some legislation that's currently in the Washington State Legislature, and that's House Bill 1388, House Bill 1389. And I know there's also 1110 around density and location. I just wondering if you can speak to anything that you're aware of in the Washington Legislature this session that you want to either amplify or bring up.
Yeah, I would say that the legislation around missing middle housing is one that I definitely support. Actually, just one second, I just have to talk to. I'm squatting in another location here. So I definitely support the missing middle bill. I believe Congressman Bateman is responsible for that. The idea being we can't continue to have single family zoning throughout the state, and especially around transit, we need to take advantage of that, those parcels. The other bill that I've actually been involved in is the Housing Benefit District bill, which is an idea to aggregate land around transit station areas and think strategically about how we're going to develop that land. The idea being the expansion of transit north and south, and also east and west to a lesser extent in our region, is a once in a multi-generation opportunity. And when you think about all these station areas going north up to Everett and south down to Tacoma, if you build 10,000 units of housing around each of those station areas, and you've got 50 or 60 station areas, that's 600,000 units. And that's what the Puget Sound Regional Council is saying over the next 50 years that we're going to need to accommodate our growth. The problem is without some strategic thinking, you could end up with 1,000 units of housing around each of those station areas. And once that's built, housing is durable. That's what we got for the next 50, 75, 100 years. And my fear is that our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will look back and say, what were you doing? You had a chance to build 500,000, 600,000 units of housing and you didn't. Why? Because local jurisdiction said, I don't want big, tall apartments around here. And if we leave it to kind of these local political decisions, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that you're not going to get the density that you need, which is why that bill is trying to intervene upstream a little bit to say, let's make sure that we think about this strategically and take advantage of this $50 billion investment we're making in transit, right? Huge investment, probably the biggest investment this region has ever made. And so those are two examples, and I know there are others as well. But anyway, but the point is the bigger picture point on this is we basically struck out in the last session, right? There were a number of bills and every single one of them failed. It was very, very disappointing. And are there some that are better or worse? Sure. But my general answer to all this is if this were an exam, I would always say it's D, all the above. If there is a proposal in there to create more housing, either through zoning, through resources, whatever the case may be, I would say, yes, I'm in support of it. And the second order question is which one's better than the other? But to me, that is way down the list in priority. The point is we need all this stuff. We need resources, we need land use reform, we need all that stuff. And then we can kind of figure out if we have to rank order them in some way. That would be my general view.
Thank you for doing that. I'm going to call out a couple of folks who have questions in the chat. Roger Werner, you have two questions. I'm going to ask you to just pick one because we have a couple people queued up. So Roger, what would be the question you want to pose to Greg? You do have to unmute yourself.
There we go. I'm unmuted. Let's go from this. Let's go for chair number 2 here. See, Seattle's a really landlord unfriendly place. It's just from the dialogue coming out of City Hall, it just the rules against the landlords, the tightness of being able to work. Are we going the wrong direction for the does that have any impact on all this?
Well, I think there needs to be a blend between supporting landlords and providing rights to tenants, right? And I think that pendulum swings from city to city and over time. And sometimes it probably swings too far in the favor of landlords, and you have massive evictions and there's consequences, and then we respond and the pendulum swings a little bit. And I've certainly heard from a lot of people saying, I think we've swung potentially too far and we need to make sure that landlords can still make a living doing this because 96 or 97% of our housing is privately owned. Right. And some people might be angry at me for saying that, but it's true. If that's the logic of our whole system, we need to make sure that people who own housing and rent it out, that it works for them. And so whether we've gone too far or not, Roger, I don't know that I'd want to go on record saying yes or no. But the point is, I think your point absolutely stands in the sense that we need to make sure that this works for landlords as well as tenants, for sure. But the point is that if we think that landlords who are in the business of making money owning real estate can end the homelessness crisis, we're fooling ourselves. We're fooling ourselves. And it's not because landlords are bad. It's just if the market rent is $3,000, I'm going to charge $3,000. And so therefore, as a society, we need to then ask ourselves, so if that doesn't work for me, if I can't afford $3,000, what does that mean about my prospects for living in the city? And if the answer is you're screwed, which is kind of what we said over the last 20 years, we're seeing the consequences of that decision. And therefore, that's why I want a robust private market where landlords can make a living and do what they do. But we also need a robust public sector to ensure that people who can't afford market rate rents can live here. And many of those people who can't afford market rate rents are people like school teachers or people working at Starbucks. Right? We have priced fundamental professions in our society out of the city, and that's a problem. And I don't blame landlords for that. Are there some bad landlords? Sure, but there are bad attorneys and investment bankers and pastors, right? They're bad people in every profession. My point is that the system that we've set up doesn't work for everyone, and we need to address that and not blame landlords for that entire problem.
Thanks, Greg. The next question we have is from Anna. And Anna, I'm not sure if that's you or Patrick.
It's both of us. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay. All right. So first, I just wanted to say that I support affordable housing and density in cities. That's not the issue. I feel, to be honest, and ironically, this is, or coincidentally, it's the same comment I had last year at your presentation. There's not any discussion about the environment and about livability within a city. These are actually, to be honest, seldom addressed by housing advocates. And oftentimes I think people who are not used to the subject come to this and they think the answer to the housing crisis is build, 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 no matter what, no matter how, wherever, whenever. But I believe that, there are costs and there do need to be regulations to a certain extent. And I'm specifically talking about environmental issues. I think that there are a lot of environmental issues here in Seattle. We have lost hundreds of acres of trees. We have a smoke season now. We have heat islands. We have all of these, different challenges. And I don't hear it as part of the vision of the future. I don't hear how that the natural world, other than transit or buying an electric vehicle, where that fits in. And in fact, housing advocates, not all, but some, actually, it gets pretty vitriolic when a person does bring up those issues. Because I think you can have density, you can have affordability, and you can have livability, and you can have that, but those discussions are not going on. And one of the reasons I am very resistant to, and I should be a person that supports this, I'm very resistant to changes in zoning because I don't feel like anything is being thought about the vision of our city. And I guess what I would like to know is what you think about that. How
Yeah, no,
it's not about, it's not about density. It's not about income. It's about how far do you go in terms of working and integrating the environment?
Totally. It's a great question. And we do talk about this in the book. And while you don't probably hear about it as much, there's a lot going on right now across the nation, kind of wrestling with these 2 points. And so I actually spoke at Boston University on a conference that was about this very issue. How do we resolve our housing crisis and be good stewards of the environment at the same time? So forgive me for not addressing that in this point because it's a homelessness presentation, but this is fundamental, I think, to my argument about land use in cities. Will housing advocates and environmental advocates at times be in conflict over specific regulation? Yes, that's true. I would argue, though, the areas of agreement are far more prevalent and certainly trump a lot of these smaller disagreements. I firmly believe that a denser city that goes up is absolutely essential to environmental protection instead of sprawling out and everyone driving a car for 2 hours to get to wherever they are. Think LA, right? And a denser city is going to be more affordable and provide way more access to people for housing. And so I believe that improved land use and denser land use in the urban core is the answer to both of those. I do not believe that maintaining 70% single family zoning in Seattle is a recipe for environmental stewardship. I really don't. And can you make those changes without losing any trees? No, you can't. You might lose some trees. I acknowledge that. But I believe I would much rather have that than seeing Seattle sprawl out to the Cascades or over the Cascades and have people driving in. I think that's a much worse reality. And the way that our society works is we can't pull up the drawbridge and say no one else can move here. So if people are going to move here and we want to be good stewards and we want to provide housing for people, let's go up, would be my answer to your question. Now, you may disagree with that, and I respect that. But I have not heard a good answer to this question of responding to both needs without greater density and changes to land use.
Greg, I'm going to read the next one. It's from Rachel. Do you have any comment or insight from your research on housing about the potential of universal basic income as a part of the potential solution? Do you know if anyone is looking into the possibility from a housing standpoint? She can imagine people suggesting that UBI will just increase costs of housing.
Yeah, great question. So there have been some really interesting UBI, and just for those of you who aren't familiar, universal basic income would be providing a base income to everyone in your society. So it wouldn't be means tested. Or it might be means tested, but in other words, you're just getting cash. And certainly part of the solution to homelessness is ensuring that people have more money. No doubt about it. And we talk about that in the book, in the sense that there are policies to increase access to housing, and there are also policies that increase income. And that can be through transfer payments, that can be through the earned income tax credit. There are all sorts of tools that we have, and we can expand those. UBI is another alternative. There was a really interesting experiment in Vancouver, Canada, using UBI, and it had very promising results for people experiencing homelessness. Giving people cash makes a difference. And so I think UBI has real potential to help. The limitation is, we aren't going to have an $85,000 UBI, realistically. And so the question then is, in a place where you have exceedingly high rents, and Vancouver has high rents too. And so the fact that they had as promising results as they did really caught a lot of people's attention, including mine. But there is a limit to the scale of that UBI. And so I think UBI is an important tool in the toolkit. It's probably not a silver bullet in the sense that that alone fixes this, but UBI combined with greater provision of housing, greater provision of affordable housing, more units, that all as a package, I think has real promise.
Thanks. And just another one in the chat, which is just, could you speak a little bit about improving transit and whether or not that falls into this picture of solving homelessness?
I think it really does. And I think this $50 billion investment, Everett down to Tacoma and over to the east side is a game changer for our region, in the sense that it will take some pressure off the urban core in terms of where people need to live. And especially with more remote work, if you work at Amazon and need to be in the office 2 days a week and can now live in Everett and take the train down, wow. One, that might be a lifestyle improvement for you, and you don't mind riding the train for an hour to get into the city 2 days a week. It allows people to live in a much broader area as opposed to congregating in the urban core here. And so, yes, I think transit is essential. And getting back to the prior question about environmental stewardship, I think that transit investment is fundamental to ensuring that we're better stewards of this earth. And so that's why this bill that I've been really passionate about and have worked on for now 6 years, ensuring that we take advantage of those station areas is so critical, because I just worry that we aren't going to take advantage of that and we'll regret it. And then all the benefits that can come from transit in terms of moving people out of the urban core, creating more affordable housing, and really and using the space that we have in our region, it might not produce as good a results as it otherwise could.
Okay, let me just open it up to folks and ask if there are any other questions. We've cleared the queue. I do have one, Greg, while people are thinking about that, and that is on the state or local level, are there examples of communities or states that are really nailing this, like really figuring it out? They've done very creative solutions and they're starting to see the curve bend.
There aren't cities that look like Seattle, but there are cities that are doing great work. So I was just in Houston 2 weeks ago. Houston, there was just a big piece written in the New York Times in June about Houston and how they cut homelessness. And so they had a big event down there. And so they invited the authors of this New York Times piece and then invited me to be in a conversation around that. And so what Houston did is they used Housing First, which is a well-known intervention around housing, which is if Greg is addicted or mentally ill, making sure that Greg gets stably housed and then providing the services that he needs has a lot of empirical support for that. There's a lot of debate around Housing First, but the evidence is very, very clear. And what Houston did is they went all in on Housing First, and they cut homelessness pretty substantially. Now, one of the challenges with this, and I had to be very careful when I was in Houston, is they have a very huge advantage over Seattle, which is they have 10 or 11% vacancy rates. So it's much easier to implement Housing First at scale when you've got 10% of your housing rental units vacant. And so when the New York Times piece came out, my phone rang and people said, why aren't we doing Housing First in Seattle? And I said, we are. We actually are. The problem is that when you don't have a unit to put someone in, how do you implement Housing First? And so the problem is the scarcity of housing, which magnifies and accentuates the homelessness crisis, also makes it harder to respond to that crisis, because the tools that we know work are dependent on units that are available and we don't have those. And so whether you're trying to prevent people from getting into homelessness or ending homelessness, the availability of units becomes really, really important. And so Milwaukee is a good example, Houston. So there are places that, and some people say, well, now you're denigrating. I'm not denigrating in any way. What they've done is taken advantage of an asset that they have and done really good work. Other places have had the same advantage and they didn't do it, right? So we should elevate and praise what Milwaukee and Houston are doing, but we also need to recognize that the same playbook will not have the same results in Seattle that it does in Houston.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to make a note that Rachel put the link of the the Tacoma UBI experiment from the Seattle Times article. So that's in the chat if people are interested in that. And I think I would love to bring in a speaker. So keep an eye open. Maybe we'll see if we can get a UBI speaker in here in the next couple months. The other thing I want to make sure folks know about is Greg's book is really wonderful. If you're in the MUCC community, we have a couple copies in the library if you haven't had a chance to read it. It is just a wonderful, wonderful resource. And Greg, will you just say the title again, just so everybody knows it?
Yes, it's Homelessness is a Housing Problem.
Yeah. Okay, then I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Most of all, I want to say thank you to you, Greg, for both your research and for the manner in which you share it. It is just a delight to listen to you, and incredibly helpful as we continue with this struggle to figure out where to help and how to help. So thank you so much for coming. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Good night.
Thank you, Greg.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for your interest in the topic.
Take care. Good night.
Thank you.
Night.